Hi everyone. Today we're going to be looking at the first part of what's going to be quite a long series of videos. In southeastern France, near the Pyrenees Mountains with Spain, lies a mystery equal to how the pyramids were built and might in fact even be linked. It revolves around the story that a priest in a small local village, Rennes Le Chateau, found a hidden treasure in the 1890s. Treasure seekers have looked for decades to locate it. And over the last 80 or 100 years, various theories have been presented as to what this treasure might have been. From the hidden gold of Merovingians, Cathars, Templars, Visigoths, a document claiming Jesus had a son, the secret of the Philosopher's Stone, the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, the tombs of Jesus or Mary Magdalene or both, the ability to time travel, and more. What is certain is that at the turn of the century, this was a seat of extremely bizarre behavior. And not just this small little town in southern France, which tends to get all of the modern focus. No, it's the whole area. This giant geographic region is one of the most unbelievable strangeness. I read this story for the first time maybe 30 years ago in Henry Lincoln's book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which was very controversial at the time, and found the whole thing a bit interesting, and it was a nice read and kind of left it alone. Then I came across a book when I was doing my Egyptian research called Hermes Unveiled by Roy Norval. And he went back into the Rennes Le Chateau story with a new way of looking at it. And it sort of piqued my interest again, even though I don't really fully agree with Norval and what he says. It was an interesting re-examination. Then about 4 years ago, I got really interested in the story. I don't remember what piqued my interest, but something piqued my interest in the story. And I began researching it in detail. I was going to write a book. And in fact, I have 8 chapters of what was in the initial stages of a manuscript that I stopped writing for various reasons, because every time I thought I might get close to finishing it, a ton of new research would just drop into my lap. And it's like it felt it was never, ever going to end. And so I'm deciding to share that with you here, a massive amount of research. And it's just so you know how weird this story really is, because so much of it, many people have you've probably come across it somewhere. It's been mentioned, it's been a part of the theory of the Da Vinci Code, it's been all sorts of things. But so much of the story, when you actually begin to research it, turns out to be like myth or fairy tale or complete misdirection. Since the 1920s, this part of southern France has been the place of murders, including murders of priests, explosions, thefts of key works of art. Key religious structures have been blown up with dynamite. I kid you not. They've used dynamite to blow up literally spectacular structures of religious art. We've had missing people, false coded documents. We've had literally a James Bond spy movie, except it's not a movie. This stuff is real. It really happened. It's happened in the last 100 years, which means we have photographs. While we don't have the original testimony of the people anymore, we at least have testimony of relatives and people connected to the story who still talked about these things in the 1970s and 80s. And the mystery, the reason I want to share the mystery now with you, because as I mentioned, everything I present, I want to feel has some sort of value to where we are right now. And this story, the original story, takes place in the 1880s and the 1890s, which is right in that time frame when the World's Fairs are exploding all over the world, when we're getting this possibility of coming out of a reset. And here is this very strange story of this very poor priest all of a sudden becoming rich beyond his dreams, building structures that are beyond the possibility of where he could get the money from, and entertaining some of France's most important and influential people in a small little out-of-the-way village with seemingly no reason for it to happen at all. And I think the time frame is really important. So you add that to the story. The story links back to just before the French Revolution, that the claims of what Saunière really found are linked just before the French Revolution. The area links even further, back to the 1640s and some very strange events that were happening during the reign of Louis in France. And we take it back to the Knights Templar, to the Cathars, to the Holy Grail, and to the times before that of the Normans, the Vikings, the Gauls, the Celts, and perhaps even linking to original information regarding the New Testament, and bizarrely, perhaps information linking to the chapter of Revelation. It's a lot of potential stuff to look into. And that's why I'm looking into it and sharing a video on this with you here. The story first came to light in the 1950s and 60s through a gentleman named Noel Corbu, Gerard de Sade, then Henry Lincoln. And all of these people and their stories are also as strange as the story that they're telling. And they're obviously, once you start researching it, they're obviously lying about things. They're openly lying about a lot of stuff. This guy here, this is Gerard de Sade, and I have one of his recent books. It's one of the bizarrest reads I've ever come across. Like it's strange. I can't say it any other way. It's like he's playing with you. That's the best way I can describe it. He's playing with you. Since that time, since I began my research 4 years ago, I've come across some really good websites, most of which have interestingly just disappeared. When I went looking for them again, they're just gone. Some of the best research is gone. A lot of really good research is still there. It's in French. My French is really poor. I've had to do a lot of work translating some of these really good sites. And there's a few other interesting books that are out there. I'll provide some links below. But a lot of this material seems to just vanish. It comes out for a while and then it just disappears. So, I leave you with a couple of things before I take you into the standard story first. And that is, the priest of this village, of Rennes Le Chateau, the one who this mystery is all surrounded by, had his tomb dug up in 2004 and was reburied in a new tomb underneath 5 tons of concrete, supposedly to keep treasure hunters and amateur researchers from digging in the cemetery. But I guarantee you, there's a lot of different ways to seal off an area in a cemetery if you need to without putting a guy under 5 tons of concrete. That's really strange. When he died in 1917, people came from all over France to the funeral procession, in which they also took one red tassel from a garment that he was wearing, in the coffin. So far, no one's been able to explain what the red tassel is, why everybody took one. It's, again, very strange. And his last words, his supposed last words, which at least, again, a lot of the story you're going to see once I share it with you is obviously made up, but it's made up as a clue to take you somewhere. It's not necessarily telling you fact, but it's not giving you false either. That's what makes the thing so strange. So his last words supposedly are claimed to be from John 23. So most people think that means John chapter 23. But if you take it another way and look at it in the chapter of Revelation about the apocalypse, also written by John, you could read it as chapter 20, verse 3, which states, "He threw him into the abyss and locked and sealed it over him to keep him from deceiving the nations any more until 1,000 years ended. After that, he would be set free for a short time," which is, of course, talking about the devil being in turn for 1,000 years of peace. So is Saunière talking about saying he was one who put the devil away for 1,000 years? Or is he the one that opened the tomb to let the devil out in the 1880s, 1890s? Did he really find a tomb of the original biblical patriarchs? I mean, let's go into the story, shall we? So this is the story that you will generally read on the average website or book. So just so that someone's new to this has the story. So Rennes Le Chateau is a small village in the Languedoc in France, almost up against the Pyrenees Mountains, and it's on the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela. Of course, it was a place of the Celtic Druids, who used and built many stone circles and standing stones in the area. It went through all sorts of areas, from Visigoths to Knights Templar to Cathars. In fact, Mount Segur, where the Cathar last stand took place, is about only 10 kilometers away, and it's just south of Carcassonne. In the original story, its priest, Francois Bérenger Saunière, his real name was Francois, but he almost never used it, was appointed by the Bishop of Carcassonne to take over at the age of 33, interesting, to be the new leader of the really withering church of Saint Madeleine in Rennes Le Chateau. He had been born not far away in Montzalis in 1852, where his father had been the mayor. He graduated from seminary 2 years after his brother Alfred, and the priest at Rennes that Saunière took over for, Anton Croix, was removed after only a few years quickly, and then June 1, 1885, Saunière takes over. Less than 6 months in, though, he gets in some trouble for making some pro-Republican political statements. And for that, he was suspended, and he had to go to Narbonne for approximately 6 more months, and a very interesting period of time we'll see in Narbonne. Supposedly, he came back because all the villagers wanted him to return. In the original, Saunière was given some money by these pro-Republican supporters, and he begins to restore the church. Again, we'll find that this story is incorrect, but this is the story that is presented. He begins to restore the church, and during the renovation, a stone column is found to be hollow, inside where he supposedly found 3 wooden cylinders containing parchments linked back to the 1780s, just before the French Revolution. He showed these parchments to the bishop, who gave him money to visit scholars at St. Sulpice in Paris to decipher the documents. Along the way, although no one claims how, he became a friend of some of the great occultists of all the underground groups in Paris, including becoming the friend and possible lover of opera star Emma Calvé. The Britney Spears of her time is potentially dating some out-of-the-way priest from southern France. He supposedly purchases 3 copies of paintings from the Louvre, which is said to be one by Poussin, 10 years, and a painting of Pope Clement V. We'll find that the Louvre didn't produce reproductions at the time. He then returns to Rennes, all of a sudden loaded with money, and starts to renovate the church in amazing style, where he then apparently finds a crypt, where he finds more treasures. Then he desecrates some local graves, builds a giant villa and a tower, in which he lives with his housekeeper and also supposed lover, Marie d'Arnaud, in incredible wealth, being visited by many of the rich and powerful of France. His early financial statements showed that when he began as a priest in 1885, he actually had a debt of 105 francs and a yearly salary of 900 francs. He was basically poor. By 1909, he had spent 600,000 francs, approximately 3 million current euros, to restore the church in what can only be described as a very non-Christian fashion, built an opulent villa, Bethania, which he never actually lived in. It was just to house the rich, wealthy occupants who came to visit him, and also built a massive tower, the Magdala, linking, of course, to the name Mary Magdalene. The story claims he gets in trouble with the new bishop of Carcassonne in 1909 and is removed as priest of the church, and lives relatively penniless for the rest of his days, selling pendants to wounded French World War I soldiers. He dies in 1917. I've told you the tassel story. We hear nothing more of the story until a man named Noel Corbu takes over and lives in the village, supposedly gets connected with Marie d'Arnaud, learns some type of secret from her, and then shares his story along with the writings of this man named Gerard de Sade in the 1960s. They both pushed the story of he found some sort of buried treasure. This is what most people believed. Then we'll see a man named Henry Lincoln, a British documentarian and actor, picks up the story, makes some documentaries, writes some books, and turns the story from small little local mystery to worldwide enigma. So that's the story as it's been explained. But let's start looking into it, the background of this in a little more detail. On Sauniere's up to Sauniere's first reprimand, where he was sent to Narbonne, the story seems to be pretty much true. He did take over in 1885. However, where he was stationed before that is very important. His first appointment was in 1879 at Alette-les-Bains, and then 1882 at L'Eclat. Each location will be detailed later on in a future video when I talk about the surrounding area, and each of these has interesting links to the priests, what they're doing there, and what's actually in each of those churches. He was then, after he was suspended from Narbonne, the work on the church when he comes back begins immediately in 1886. Not 1891 as the story suggests, which is actually an important year in the story. You'll find that he later on he puts up a very specific monument in that year. But he actually begins the renovation and supposed digging in 1886. Something happened in Narbonne. Not only did he have the money to begin his work, because it would have cost millions to do this, and he also seemed to know exactly where to dig and what to do. So, was the sending to Narbonne an accident, or was it part of the plan that he had to get out there and be connected with certain people? It's also in this year he gets very connected to the priest across the valley at Rennes-le-Bains, Henry Boudet, who had written a very strange book, and I mean strange, called The Chromelex of Rennes-le-Bains, which we're also going to examine in a future video. And yeah, almost every priest in this area has some bizarre background and story, and every single church in the area has symbolism, right out of the Knights Templar. So, as I mentioned, of 1891 and how important that year was. Now, we know he couldn't have bought the paintings from the Louvre because the Louvre didn't sell reproductions in those years. We don't know how Saunière and this Calva became lovers, and again, why would Britney Spears of the time be involved with a way-out priest? However, there seems to be quite a connection between Emma Calvet, who used to have the name Calvet, changed her name, to one Mariana Calvet, who was a young woman who had a very specific vision. And in the vision, the Virgin Mary came to her and spoke the words, I believe, penitence, penitence, which becomes the very words that Saunière in 1891 puts on this pillar that marks a very strange mission, as he called it. So this connection between the Calvets, this woman who had this supposed vision of the Virgin Mary, as soon as the bishops of the time found out about this, as opposed to doing what had happened at Lourdes and sort of creating a deified story of the event, they shipped her off to England, put her in a mental hospital, and in a sense just shut her up. And a lot of the reason of why Calvet, they feel, changed her name is to distance herself from the woman who had what was likely quite a real vision. She's also linked to the chateau at Aveyron, which she purchased, which happened to be the place where the books of alchemist Nicholas Flamel were hidden. So, what's more about Saunière is that he seems to have found, for sure have found, another altar in the church which had a cover stone the wrong way up, which had a symbolic painting of a knight on a horseback, which seemed to be the entrance to an old crypt. As soon as that was discovered, he sent the workmen home and locked the church door. Some excavations 50 years later on that very spot only found a skull with a ritual slot in the top. And that's a very important alchemic image. He then stopped all restoration in 1894 and now began to wander the countryside with a sack on his back, in which he brought back stones to make into a small grotto garden in front of the church. Now, these trips to the countryside may have had nothing to do with bringing back stones. That may have been just a misdirection for what he was doing. There is suggestion that he was going into various graveyards, potentially digging up bodies or defacing certain gravestones so that you couldn't read what was on the gravestones. Some others might be suggesting that he was taking Henry Boudet's book of the countryside and going out and doing certain things in various areas described in the book. Right after this, now Saunière seems like he travels all over Europe. He had 3 bank accounts in large French cities. He had a 4th bank account in Budapest linked to the Habsburg monarchy. All of this while his housekeeper remained at the church, not just to oversee what was going on there at the time, but apparently she was in charge of looking after the flood of money orders that just started showing up from all over Europe from various religious communities, and would send out letters supposedly from Saunière to various people to make it look like he was still in the church when he's actually somewhere else in Europe. Then he seems to just stop traveling all of a sudden, except to one out-of-the-way Spanish village. And then he does something even more strange. Now he renovates the church. He lays down a checkerboard floor similar to the one in Freemasonry. He puts a devil at the front door, opposite a John the Baptist baptizing Jesus statue that we'll get to in a future video. He puts up the famous motto outside. He puts up the famous motto of Jacob outside the front door of how terrible is this place. He puts inside the front door the Templar motto of in this sign thou shalt conquer. He puts the 14 stations of the cross up in reverse order. He has unique paintings in the church, some in fact painted by him himself, including one of Mary Magdalene kneeling in a grotto, while in front of her is the skull, the open book, and the cross made of acacia bushes. All of the land surrounding the church was purchased, all in Marie's name, not his. Then the tower and the guest house built, the place where he entertained the rich traveling guests. He never lived there, though. He built one of the most opulent villas in all of southern France, but he never lived there. He kept living in a very small rundown presbytery next to the church, which we will see also has some very bizarre, strange connections and possibly tunnels and crypts and tombs underneath it. Marie would constantly walk around with the latest Paris fashions. And it wasn't until this period of 1909 when the new bishop in Carcassonne decided to charge Saunière with what he called the trafficking of mass, meaning charging money for church services, perhaps as a way to try to find out where is all this money that he has coming from. He went to several tribunals. He was giving various penalties, which he never actually accepted. And finally, in 1911, he was removed from his post. I talked about his final words, which were taken by Abbe Riviera of Esperanza. And afterward, the same Abbe Riviera made extreme renovations to his church, including adding a grotto with a strange figure of Jesus laying in his tomb with his eyes open. There's going to be a lot of this stuff. One of the very interesting, real interesting pieces we're going to come is a page that comes supposedly from the priest just before the French Revolution, who wrote in his, I guess what you call diary, or no, I guess it was in the church records, and he just wrote in French, of course, Jesus of Nazareth is not buried here, over and over and over again, which of course would make sense. Why would Jesus of Nazareth be buried in southern France? But he wrote it continuously over and over and over on a few sheets of paper. And somehow all of these, the theory is that Saunière got in touch with all of these various clues that had been left for him and found whatever the treasure is and whatever the treasure is supposed to be, which certainly has nothing to do with money. The money is coming much later on from people either rewarding him for doing a really good job, or the money is like a silencer to keep his mouth shut from whatever he's found or did. So we go to Marie de Narnaud, who kept living because she was much younger than Saunière. So she kept living after Saunière died, and she kept living in the presbytery on church grounds. And even though and remember, the property is in her name, she could have sold it. She was poor too. She could have sold the property that she owned and made a ton of money, but she sold none of it. She just kept on living pretty much in poverty, so it says. The myth of the story says that in 1945, when France was following the German occupation, they reissued a new French franc in order to try to catch those who were profiting from the Nazis. So when you changed money from the old francs to the new francs, you had to explain where your money come from. And the story says that, well, Marie didn't want to have to explain how a semi-peasant girl wound up so rich. So instead of trading money in for new francs, she simply buried it in the church garden. And that myth is definitely not true. There's no indication that she had large amounts of money at all. All of her wealth was in the property. What we do know is that in 1946, she could at least sell the property, now that the Germans were gone, in the new francs and not have to explain anything of how she got the real estate to sell. Claiming in 1946 she meets a new visitor, this guy, Noel Corbu, and for some bizarre reason sells him to church on July the 22nd, which is the feast day of the Magdalene, in 1946, as long as he promised to look after her, and for doing so she would tell him a great secret before she died that would make him rich beyond his wildest dreams. This is the Corbu story of it. She had also apparently mentioned to friends several times during the years, "The people of the area walk on gold, yet you do not know it." The myth claims that Corbu and Marie met at a picnic at Rennes Le Chateau in 1946. But there seems to be a photo here of Marie and Corbu's wife, which is dated to 1941, which indicates they must have known each other for quite a long time before that, and probably knew him quite well before she sold him the property in 1946. Perhaps it had sold the property long before without making it public until after the German occupation. Corbu is a very strange guy. He was born in Paris in 1912, but he lived his youth in Morocco due to his father being an embassy attaché. In 1935, he marries the woman there, Henrietta Cole. By 1994, he became a businessman and moved to Bugarch, the near the famed mountain that, some woman wrote a book about something about UFOs or portals to other worlds, or I don't remember the details of that book now, but he moved to Bugarch. But Corbu has a connection to the Vatican, which is very interesting because there was a moment where his son was having problems getting into a certain seminary. I don't have the story written down completely, but Corbu was able to contact the Vatican and get in touch with the person who later became the Pope, who was like one of the cardinals at the time, and this soon-to-be Pope is the one who sent Corbu some letter to the very specific school that allowed his son to have entrance. So what is the Vatican, and particularly the soon-to-be Pope, doing, helping out some nobody businessman in Bugarch in southern France to get his kid into a particular seminary, the very same guy who buys all the property later off Marie Denarnaud? You're starting to see how the story already, we're not even getting into the detail of the story, we're just getting into the overview of it, and it's already bizarre beyond completion, beyond belief. At some point, it seems like Corbu was potentially buying the property for the Vatican, that there seemed to have been some sort of behind-the-scenes thing going on, that the Vatican was going to purchase the Rennes Chateau land through Corbu, but Corbu reneged on the deal at some point. Maybe he found out more than he bargained for, and we might say wanted to keep it for himself. We do know that Marie dies on January 17, and January 17 is going to become a date that just floods this story. Everything in the story happens on January 17, which is, we'll get into what that date actually relates to in all sorts of terms. She suffered an incident which apparently left her conveniently unable to speak, and she died a few weeks later. Corbu cared for her apparently during her illness, but supposedly was unable to get any kind of confession or any kind of treasure wisdom because she was unable to speak during this pre-death illness. Convenient. He did, however, take all of Sauniere's papers and effects that Marie had, and with Marie no longer around, he updated the villa, turned it into a hotel, and then began starting a story, sharing the story of Bérenger Saunière and his riches, and the story of his riches, and his story of his amazing treasure, which came out in a newspaper article in 1956, and started to get people coming to Rennes Le Chateau and to his hotel. At this point, a new character comes in, but Corbu doesn't stay around. He doesn't get to be around too long to see what happens. He sold the estate in 1964 to one Henry Buthillon, and he moved to St. Felix. Just as the guy I'm talking about, Gerard de Sade's book, comes out, Noel Corbu dies in a car crash right in front of the monastery of Pruel, the very place where Saunière spent a 10-day sentence handed out by the Catholic Church in 1911. Interesting, huh? So Gerard de Sade, the guy who has a strange book that I showed you, through his investigations, he apparently meets Pierre Plantard and Philippe de Cesare, who offers them information on their own failed book attempt on the village from 1962. But we do find out that actually Plantard and de Sade had known each other for a long, long time before that. In fact, written a book together in the 1950s on a strange crypt found in Normandy. So again, once they put the book on Rennes Le Chateau together, they're already lying about their own connection before they even write the book. De Sade adds a bunch of bizarre parchments that he claims to be originals from Saunière. We find that later on that they're not, but they are documents that are in this book, which relate in Latin and Greek to various New Testament Gospels, but contain odd letters or phrases. This book came out as called The Gold of Rennes, or The Strange Life of Bérenger Saunière, the priest of Rennes Le Chateau. He doesn't go into any detail about the parchments. He doesn't go into any specific codes or details in the book. He just lays out the story pretty much as Corbu did, but with some very, very odd clues is the best way to describe it in the book. But the basic story is of a gold treasure hunt and some information to some old Merovingian kings and an obscure secret society called the Priory of Sion, which again might be true, might not be true. It's a place that's had extremely strange experiences, strange deaths. But that takes us after de Sade to a gentleman named Henry Lincoln. Henry Lincoln became famous as the main writer of Holy Blood, Holy Grail. He wrote this book, actually, which is very good, The Holy Place, where he gets into the very detailed geometry of the landscape of Rennes Le Chateau. And that's a really important part of the story that gets downplayed a lot, is the incredibly beyond coincidental geometric patterns that everything, not only the landscape, but the churches and the layouts and the ancient structures all create. But his story, which is also strange as beyond belief, was that he was on holiday in France in 1969 looking for something to read, and he happened to buy a copy of the first of de Sade's book. That book was called The Accursed Treasure. Interestingly, de Sade had 3 reprints of the book, 3 hermetic number. Lincoln was so amazed by the story that he read that he moved to southern France and began to investigate. He then found that there was a code in the parchments, one very easy to find and then one more difficult to find. He wondered why de Sade would publish the documents of the mystery but not point out the obvious codes. Lincoln was not a historian or a researcher. He was an actor and a documentary creator. And he started making documentaries on the BBC on the story in the 1950s. Or in the 1970s. He wound up meeting de Sade, and when he asked him why, according to Lincoln's story, why didn't you publish the code in the book, de Sade's answer was, well, we thought it would interest someone like you to find it for yourself. And to Lincoln, he claimed this was his realization that the mystery was much bigger than he ever thought. But again, the story doesn't match the fact, because Henry Lincoln is not the real man's name. His real name is Henry Soskin. And Henry Soskin was an actor who didn't change his name to Lincoln until 1967, the same year de Sade has published his book. The next year, he writes and has small parts in a very odd horror movie called The Crimson Altar, which starred Boris Karloff, and it's really strange. And once you look at it with the eyes of the Rennes Le Chateau story, you can see elements of the Rennes Le Chateau story in this movie, The Crimson Altar. And then the very next year is the year he supposedly finds a book by Gerard de Sade and starts studying the mystery. But that almost seems quite obviously not true. Again, it's just these coincidences in the story are too big to just be coincidences. But he does wind up eventually writing the book Holy Blood, Holy Grail, claiming that the entire mystery is all about a bloodline of Jesus running through Mary Magdalene, who had come to France shortly after the resurrection. At the time, the book caused outrage in various religious and historical communities, and even some of the original people who had been involved in the story and interviewed in the documentaries like Plantard and Deciphering got very scared because Lincoln's work now seemed to suggest that they were descendants of Jesus. And they started admitting immediately that they forged the documents weren't real. And it wouldn't really explain, if that was the story, it wouldn't explain why Saunière would get so rich and powerful over knowledge of something like that. Why would the Catholic Church want to give millions of euros equivalent for him not to say anything about a bloodline of Jesus, if that's the real story? Because it would have been easier just to kill him. I've got lots of detail of various priests at the same time period, like for example Antoine Gilles, in Halloween 1897, a good friend of Saunière and Boudet, from the priest of Custassa, was bludgeoned with an axe. Just had his head virtually chopped off. And then his body was mutilated and laid out in a ritualistic manner with a pack of Russian cigarettes beside the body and the words penciled in, "Viva Angelina." No one was ever charged with the murder. No one could ever possibly understand what the Viva Angelina meant, why there was Russian cigarettes there, or who actually killed him, when they found that for years he had become absolutely paranoid and would never open the door of the church. He kept everything locked completely and would never open the door to anybody unless he knew who they were, and there's no sign of forced entry in the death. But if they killed off Antoine Gilles in obviously a very ritual manner, well, why wouldn't they kill off Bérenger Saunière too for finding something he shouldn't have found? So something tells me the story is much more than what Henry Lincoln is presenting. And Henry Lincoln, right at the time that he produced Holy Blood, Holy Grail, was just starting to get into the geometry theory, was just starting to get into showing the bizarre pentagrams on the landscape and the distance between churches and the distance between grottos and mountains and tombs and everything else was on the landscape. And just as that happened, he got involved, somehow met the two other writers that wrote the book with him. I can't remember the names off the top of my head now, it's been so long. But they're also very odd guys. And all of a sudden, the research goes from where it was heading into the landscape and into the story of everything that's there and everything that was strange about it, and moved it to this bloodline, Jesus bloodline theory. Almost like it was a way of deflecting away from where the research was headed that might be quite truthful into a way that was going to, on one hand, create a whole lot of controversy, a whole lot of discussion, and all of Lincoln's time was going to be spent at that point just dealing with the book that he just wrote, rather than get to what I guess he really wanted to write about, which comes up later. Since that book was written, hundreds more have been printed on all sorts of topics. You've got countless documentaries, and the small town is revolutionized. The nice, sleepy, mysterious Rennes Le Chateau has become Sedona, Europe, basically. It's full of $2,000 Euro weekend motor coach tours, drumming circles, crystal sales, UFO sightings, channeling sessions. You know, whenever there's a big mystery out there, there's always somebody who wants to make a few dollars off of it. In this case, a lot of dollars off it. I took a look just for fun before I did the video. Some people are still, even though with the situation we're in, they're still offering tours coming up of the area. The prices are staggering to go on these motor coach tours. And I've noticed that a lot of researchers, there are some good researchers out there. I'll leave some links below to a few things that are still actually pretty good that are left on the internet. One by a guy named Ben Hammett, even though he was found recently for faking a tomb. He actually claimed to have found a tomb and claimed I think it was the tomb of Mary Magdalene, and it was obviously a fake, and he himself admits now that he faked it. But his website is actually pretty good. It's got a lot of decent information. There's a few others out there, and I'll leave the links. But a lot of the researcher, Andre Duzet is another really good researcher in this topic, who still has stuff in English. But they don't seem to work together too much. It seems to be a very separate kind of thing. Everybody works on their own little thing, their own little idea, their own little theory, and not a lot gets shared with it. But that's the background of the story of Rennes Le Chateau. And you may say, well, I haven't really said very much. I've just talked for 40 minutes. I haven't said much, and that's true. But I had my choice of, do I try to cram into 1 hour the absolute most amazing stuff, Or do I take this in the way I would do it in a book, which is a much slower, more complete overview for you, so that as we do get into when works of art are getting blown up by dynamite and other people are getting murdered, and was Otto Rahn a member of the Nazi SS who found the Cathar treasure and escaped? What's the detail on the New Testament? What's the story from the Cathars on baptism, and what's the story? How does that relate to the story? And I wanted to take this slowly for you, and in some form of progression, so that we can, just like reading a book, give you time to hear some information, digest it, think about it, hopefully want to go on to the next topic, because topic 2, chapter 2, is all about the very strange parchments. We're going to get into the paintings of Nicholas Poussin, the tomb that they had found in the village of Arques, and in fact even the name of Arques, how that links to the word Archon and to Arcadia, two unique, one the term of the parasitic entities in our realm, the other the place of, you might call, primal goodness or primal peace and harmony. And it's interesting that it starts with the same word, and that the tombs in Poussin's paintings, and not just that one painting, the famous one, Shepherds of Arcadia, which is in the Louvre. We're going to look at a number of Poussin paintings that potentially link to this story. We're going to look at this gravestone story of Maria de Negra, and see what might be true or not true about that. The next, we'll go into alchemy and the story of how alchemy and the Hermetic wisdom links into this story. That's just chapter 2. Chapter 3 would be on the Church of Rennes Le Chateau in detail. What the changes were, what the symbolism is, what the paintings are, what the grounds are, what the tower is. Chapter 4 will take us into all the areas of the surrounding villages, from places close by, from Esperaza and Cuaza and Rennes-les-Bains and Alat-les-Bains, all the way through to Spain and into places like Genoa and Perlos, and even into various paintings in Rome and in Paris that relate to this period. We'll go even deeper in further chapters to look at the Knights Templar, and in fact the Knights Hospitalier, and how they are not one and the same, how that links to the famous society Saint Sulpice, and then we'll have to go in and look at the churches of Saint Sulpice and Chartres, and how those two churches in Paris and just outside Paris link to the mystery, and perhaps link to the mystery of the founding of Montreal, Canada, perhaps showing that the Holy Grail existed at a place called Montreal de Sauce, very close to Rennes Le Chateau, with a very unique Templar/alchemic cave and incredible relief drawings on the cave walls. I've already done one on the Cathars, so I won't have to go into them, but then we have to go further into the mysteries of the Holy Grail and discuss how the Holy Grail and that story fits in to what might be going on at Rennes Le Chateau. And then we'll have to go into digging into the New Testament and digging into not just the chapters or areas that are being referenced directly in the story, but other things in the story of Jesus and the Baptist and Mary Magdalene, and how these characters, Peter, John, everyone else, can be found within the story of Rennes Le Chateau in southern France, and what that might actually mean. So it's such a huge area of discussion, and you might say, I didn't present too much today. I'm hopefully just presenting enough to get you to say, there's a lot of weird stuff with this story, and I'm curious to read, to go through the further videos I'm going to do in the next few days that take us through this. I'm also going to do some videos coming up, just so you're aware. I've got one I'm going to be doing also on the urban fires of the 1800s, because that's a part of my book, exposing the expositions that I think needs to be done in a much deeper way. I'm going to look into one particular tomb on the Giza Plateau, which is one of my absolute favorite places to be in Egypt. So I've got all those things on the go over the next couple of weeks. Hopefully I'll have all this done and completed for you. So thanks again to everybody who's come over and subscribing and watching my channel. I'm going to do my best to keep finding things that I hope are interesting and thought-provoking for you, and try my best also not to be too often telling you what to think. Trying to share my opinion, share my stories, share my experiences, and give you encouragement to, as always, look within and find the answers where, of course, they always are, within each and every one of us. See you soon with Chapter 2 of the Rennes Le Chateau story, and with Urban Fires. Cheers.